So things like challenging assumptions. Well, that's one thing to say, can we do this? But if you start looking at the data and the data says you should challenge this assumption. And one of the things I've learned is that 76% of business owners regret selling their business within a year. The way that we're looking at things in terms of using that data in a predictive way, it's almost like driving your car looking in the rearview mirror.
Hi, everyone. Today, we are in an episode of Risk and Productivity Podcast. We are with a very special guest here. This is Nick Welham. He's the president and founder of Ceiling Consulting LLC. And we're basically going to talk about how companies can accelerate their growth and valuation as during daily operations. So welcome, Nick. Thank you for making the time.
Deepak, it's great to be here. Thank you for inviting me. Hey, my pleasure. It's great to support you and support Moy. So
Thanks, Nick. Can you just maybe just start with a brief overview of yourself, your background, and what you've been doing all these years? I know we spent a lot of time in business school many years ago, and you have progressed a lot since then. So really interested to know what you've been up to, and we'll go from there.
So my background is in operations and technology. I'm kind of a tech geek at heart, but I appreciate data, finance, and operational, excellence, shall we say. So I think around the time that I had the pleasure of meeting you and Madhu at the Executive MBA program, I was in the throes of leading a turnaround at my former business. And, we're talking about data. I don't know if we knew about AI at that time, but, when you're in the middle of a turnaround, you have to start looking, you have to look hard. So things like challenging assumptions. Well, that's one thing to say, can we do this? But if you start looking at the data and the data says you should challenge this assumption, then, you can actually make things happen. I love to hear the phrase nowadays, that's the way we've always done things. As a consultant, my ears just perk up at that stuff because I want to know, really, tell me more.
Right.
So, but yeah, talking about data. So, for me at the time, it was looking at the financial reports. I saw we were spending an incredible amount of money on doing lab draws. At the time, we had basically a program that didn't require them for most people. And the reason we were doing it is we thought we had to. And in fact, when we really dug into it, nobody on reflection thought that we should have to do it. And in fact, we discovered there were a few legal liabilities that were around that if it wasn't done properly. So that was, a winner that saved us good amount of money. And it was one of the things that contributed to the turnaround. So it was a data-driven decision based on challenging assumptions. And we'd done that before in the organization around marketing, looking at how potentially you could link up phone calls and really understand when people called, where did they call from? And we've thrown a lot of money out there these days. At this time it was the Red Plums and Save-Ons. We were spending money with those guys. Did we know that we were getting a good return? We found we did, but we didn't know. So when you know, you can make decisions. I actually exited the business after turning it around. And I thought, well, how do I do this? I'm sure I can figure this out. I'm in business school. I know how to do a discounted cash flow. I can figure out how much my business is worth. But I didn't really know exactly the tools and techniques. And I really didn't know the range of options I had to exit. So I looked around for a strategic exit. I started negotiations. They didn't pan out. And we ended up doing an internal transfer. Now, if you told me at the time that there were 8 or more ways that you can exit a business, I think my head would have exploded. But I wish somebody would have been there to help me and guide me. And I'll talk more about that in a second. So once I exited the business, I formed Ceiling Consulting. The idea at the time was that I'd seen that I was speaking a different language. So as a CEO versus a CIO. I do fractional CEO, COO work for a range of companies, particularly in the medical space, but also professional services, some manufacturing. And I've started to think about circling back to exit planning before COVID. Didn't work out, but last year I became a certified exit planning advisor, pulled a lot of my work together, drew on my experiences of both running a company, exiting, and gives me the ability to help others. Don't make my mistakes, or at least proceed in an informed way. And one of the things I've learned is that 76% of business owners regret selling their business within a year. And It's a sense of dislocation. I remember sitting there on the 4th of January of 2018. I think I had 3 emails. And I know that probably sounds blissful, right?
Yeah.
But when you've been the center of things and part of something, you feel very disconnected. And I regretted selling my business for about 15 minutes. And then I got back when I was very fortunate. I had great settlement, I got everything I wanted, and I'm going to move forward. But I think other people are less lucky. And so it's partly about education, it's partly about setting people up for their next act, whatever that might be, and ensuring they're excited about it and really ensuring they're understanding that, hey, there's going to be a huge change here. Your life is going to change. Not only it's about work, but it's also about home, it's about your finances. And so when you're talking about starting a business, we're all going to exit that business one way or the other. The question is, are you going to do it on your terms, or are you going to let terms be dictated to you by external circumstances? And, what's the point? What's the meaning for you? So it's really thinking about, your business as a wealth generation asset, and, having owners really consider their options and form a plan that works for them, that works for their families, that works for their legacy. And I'll talk more about exit planning and what people should consider for a successful exit later. Over to you. I think I've probably
Yeah.
rambled
No,
for a
that's
while.
great, Nick. That's pretty mind-boggling that 76% of people regret exiting their business. That's new to me, and I can just see it boggles the mind. There are so many ways to exit, also, and uh, when you just come back, just circling back a little bit more about the frameworks. With data, right? So you mentioned
Sure.
something about data. We talked about the value of your business. We also talked about, how to exit. What is the framework you can think about your exiting strategy?
Yep.
Can you talk a little bit more about how data and AI can drive value to the business, and what are those
Sure.
frameworks? Yeah.
I was thinking about data, and Deepak, are you familiar with the story behind the Cadbury's flake? Do you
No.
know? Okay, so for those of you who don't know, the Cadbury's flake is an amazing chocolate bar. I think you can get them here. But the story is in the 1920s, somebody noticed that when the other chocolate bars came off the production line, they had a little bit of mold flash on there. The molds weren't quite right, so they scraped the little bits off the side, and they tended to clump together. Now, it makes for, somebody said, well, why are we throwing that away? And I think in perhaps terms in the past, it's kind of like you were wasting the flakes. But now we're on a whole different level around data and business, right? Maybe you could run an inefficient business and be okay now. But the way that we're looking at things in terms of using that data in a predictive way, it's almost like driving your car looking in the rearview mirror. And it's okay when the road is straight, but as we found out in the last couple of years, the road can be quite twisty and turny. So we need to use that data, and we can't afford to just discard it. It's not about operational efficiency. It's really a matter of survival. So I'm going to share my screen, if you don't mind, and
Mhm.
talk about the framework. So I think you can see that. So I'm
Yeah.
using the Exit Planning Institute's model here to describe what's going on. And they have 3 phases. So it's discover, prepare, decide. So the first phase is discovery, and I'll talk about how the data applies to that. Couple of questions here. The owner is always very curious about what's my business worth. And at this point, we're not talking about a formal business valuation. We're talking about looking at a couple of things. And it's the owner's preparedness, which has a high impact on that. And some of that is around data around, when I said treat your business as a wealth generation asset, is it better to remain in this business, or could you actually get a better return somewhere else? Are you emotionally attached to the business? A lot of us spend an enormous amount of time working in our businesses, and this is not a data-driven decision, right?
Mhm.
Blood, sweat, and tears into these businesses, and we don't want to let go. And then there's the business readiness. So this is now where we're getting into the realm, that we would normally think of data. And so, if the owner's, spending 80 hours a week running around, hair on fire, spinning plates, whatever you want to call it, and the business just really isn't ready for a sale. And I'll talk about more about how that impacts the value and how the data can help, using data and AI can get you there in a bit. Then you've got the business attractiveness. So a business that's well run, where you've got systems and processes in place, probably is going to be a great place to work, probably is going to have a great product. And I say probably, I mean will, right? And so it becomes more attractive to others. So unless it's in an incredibly niche industry where there's really no demand either for a strategic acquisition to bolt on a new line of business, the chances are you're going to get known. You're going to get known as a great place to work, and you're going to get known for your great products, and that becomes a very attractive thing. So this is the initial phase. We talk about this. We talk about, things like building up a strategy, informing your family that's what's going on. And then we get to the prepare phase. So you notice there's two streams there. There's personal and financial planning. We talked about the whole dislocation, but I will give a very brief overview of what that looks like in terms of like, do I have enough money to retire? What's next? What are my possibilities? Now, I don't focus on that. I leave that complicated stuff to the financial advisors. But I talk about business improvement. And one of the key things here is mitigating risk. De-risking is a huge part, and using data, I think, is incredibly important. And I know that, I've seen the demo. I love the demo that you guys have got. There's a manufacturing site, and they thought that the risk was in one place, but in fact, using the data and using Moy's systems, they were able to identify that no, their risk was in another location, and they could use that new data to actually lower their accident rate. So the first phases are things around mitigating risk. How do we control that and mitigate? And then how do we go into business improvements? So whether you want to call them 90-day sprints, rocks, incredibly important to have data around them, because you can use the data to say, yeah, sure, we did well on that sprint, we crushed that rock. But if you don't have that overarching data and a strategy, it's like the old Yogi Berra saying, if you don't know where you're going, every road leads there. So you don't want to be just crashing rocks for the sake of it. So at this point, I also talk to owners about exit options. And then they make a decision roughly every 90 days. Does it make sense to exit or harvest the value? So when I talk about readiness and attractiveness, are the owners ready to exit the business? Key things here: planning, written plans. Does your family know about the plan? So that's incredibly important. But what impact does data have on this? Well, I think that having data really allows you to get a full picture. I don't know if the implementation of AI will make businesses easier. You might feel more disconnected, so you have less passion, which may make it easier to exit. Certainly having the owner ready to exit is critically important, because a lot of people don't want to stick around. They don't want to work that last year. They can't do it. But the truth is, like I said, we're all going to exit our businesses. I can talk about the 5 Ds: death, divorce, disability, disagreement, and distress. And the question is, who can run the business? And if you've got a data-driven business where you've got process and systems in there, the owner is decoupled, and that's important. They're decoupled from the business. They're certainly providing leadership, but they are decoupled from the business. So how ready is the business for transition? This is probably where we're normally thinking around kind of structural capital, the operations, the marketing, and the rest of it, and the finance. But once you have the data behind that, you can make a good decision. And then the last thing is, attractiveness. So, how long has the business been in operation? And so it's always a risk reward thing to somebody else, right? I want to buy a business. I'm a little scared because I'm worried I might waste my money or buy a lemon. So de-risking the business and also using data to show that you can make good decision making and you understand your business, I think we'll do that. And I'll show you a little bit about how that plays into both the value and the exit value. So if I was to go through a business, I'd look at 4 areas. So it'd be human capital, customer capital, structural capital, and then cultural capital. So here, these are some of the questions I would ask. But if you're thinking about AI, how will it change your talent strategy? Which roles will be necessary in the next couple of years? We know there's a tremendous amount of change. When you look at traditional HR, you're talking about performance evaluations, right? Who are your best performers? Or who will your best performers be when you have AI in the organization? How will that change? How can you use that data? You might find some reticence from employees to share information and ideas if it means they might lose their job if they can make it simpler. But I know we're looking generally at AI and data as a productivity tool, but I think that the implementation has to be carefully managed and expectations set to reassure people that we have a plan and you're on the bus and we'll take care of you. The next one's customer capital. It's really about quality of earnings, right? Reoccurring revenue, good cash flow. I would normally talk about, do you have metrics of a sales team? Do you hold them accountable? But now I'm really thinking about, what's the innovation in gathering intelligence around sales and marketing to answer that old chestnut of who are my customers and where do I find them, right? So we want to find the right people at the right time and deliver an amazing experience. And this, I think, is where AI and data can have an amazing impact throughout that RevOps cycle. You want to find people at that, in the marketing sense, at that intersection of attention and intention. So when I'm out there, I see two levels of use. One is pretty straightforward. It's a time saver. You're gathering a collection. It's collection and synthesis, right? It's like having a very smart college student that doesn't really have much real world experience going out there and doing stuff and bringing it back to you. What makes my customers tick? What do they look like? And how do I bond with them? I see applications out there to gather information, say to make sales calls, the aggregators. So, great products out there like Zoom Info or Top Sale. I've seen people using LLMs. So, for example, you can ask ChatGPT, if you use disk, let's say, what disk style is this person, and paste in their LinkedIn URL and it'll go out there. Now, it was pretty basic, but it certainly was like, okay, that works. That gave me a start. So that's kind of the one level. And then the next is the meta-analysis. And this is, where you guys come in, but it's really, reaching conclusions and producing a new experience. So using machine learning to look at both the external variables, personal performance, and come back with those weighted connections and really learn and change the weighting. So I've seen examples where people have made synthetic data to mimic people's actions in particular circumstances, say as a training aid. There's a product out there called Udly where you can actually role play a sales call and you can feed in information about what you want to be challenged on, should we say. Now you can do that with an LLM as well, but it's very different when you feel like you're talking to a human. Right? Or somebody as you recognize as a human. And so here we are, structural capital, people, processes, IP, operations. So question is, will AI enhance your business or create risk? Gathering data certainly works. I mean, at least you can identify the holes. But when you start building on things, what's going to be the result? So I can see it, playing and does play an incredibly important role in terms of workflow automation. You can replicate and automate. You can also validate that people are following the rules as well to ensure, that you've got a kind of continual QA. And, when I look at some of the examples from Moy, that's effectively what you're doing, where you're providing that on a complete basis rather than, say, a human partial basis to get the difference in results. You can use it for augmentation where it can't replace, and the monitoring. So in terms of what I see out there, small to mid-sized businesses, generally they're focusing on apps. Medium to enterprise, call it homebrew, for lack of a better word, but developing their own. And there's benefits on both sides, and it's around speed and risk. And the last area is social capital. And I think that this might be the biggest change. If I said, does your company have a brand or a vibe that attracts clients and prospective employees? Well, what's going to happen? I think with data, we know that we can provide a better organization. Some of this really is subjective. It's about how you feel rather than objective. But with AI, I mean, let's think about what we're seeing, right? I personally use Grammarly, right? But when your communication is mediated through AI, what are the implications for culture? Does it homogenize it? Has my writing become more homogenized and standard? Does Nick come through? I go sometimes when I look at what the changes are. It's a good thing that perhaps my grammar and my writing style doesn't come through. But then the question is, taking it to the next level rather than just communicating, where we're talking about how AI could potentially come here and change things. How do you attract talent to a commoditized environment if it's truly going to homogenize? And people value group membership for some reason. We all got reasons for belonging to groups. But if it's all kind of the same, how do you retain people? Because one organization might start looking like the next. And the other thing is, I worry and wonder if there's going to be a bigger divide between those who are driving the technology and those who are just trying to hold on to their jobs and do what they need and so on.
Mhm.
So I'll go back to this, how attractive is it? When you look at this risk and reward, a risky business will sell for less. I'll talk about that in a little bit. We talked about de-risking the business using AI and data, whether it's, physical accidents, whether it's making the right decisions at the right time, and then also being able to decouple the owner. So talent changes. I think that, AI and data will change our needs. I think communication could well be improved. We need to make sure that this technology enables, not hinders. And I think it can have a profound effect on reputation management. So good people, good products attract buyers, can attract more potential buyers and increase the price. But I would say in terms of the risk for business, you need a strategy. You need to really understand the risk and reward, and you need to know what the ROI is. Because at some point it's going to hit a roadblock, much like almost every development project, and you need to push through, to get through those implementation issues. Second thing I'd say is do your research before you start. Don't miss out on bootstrapping. AI vendors are an agile bunch, So I know that Moy worked with, was it a real estate agent? It was insurance. You guys talked about that. You stepped out of what you've been doing and were able to provide a solution very quickly that solved a huge job for those guys just by asking. Right. So think about how you can, what might work and start talking to people. A couple of things I also see is security. I saw a briefing the other day around Microsoft Copilot. It goes through and it indexes, right? Think about a search index. It stores it somewhere. It's given admin level security. You can go around all the documents and you can ask it, or you can, if you don't set this up properly, to display the contents of documents without actually opening them. And because it's going back to its own index store, it's not logged because you haven't opened the document. Copilot did originally. You're just looking at Copilot's version. So that's a little scary. So there's definitely security implications around, your data, your IP, and going to data and IP. The question is, where is it processed, right? So we're taking all this information and we're sending off to the cloud. We assume that we have a firewall or, an onion around it, layers of security. But what about the processing? Where's that going? Is it stored? Once again, I know you guys, have thought about this and you have the on-site option for processing. So you're ahead of the game. So.
Yeah, this is really interesting, Nick. The ability for data and AI to improve the value in a business is, I mean, it's pretty clear, right? Although, how do you actually measure this impact, this ROI, as you're doing this, right? So if you have, let's say you did, I mean, I can think about a simple example where you have a machine automated factory versus a human capital factory. And the value of the machine automated factory should be higher because of its, of the automation, the level of consistency, the insulation from human capital problems and things like that. Although that is true, the automation also comes with its own risks. Like you said, it comes with security risk. How has it been executed? So although it's quite clear that an automated or a highly data-driven business is more valuable, but how do you actually measure this impact in a holistic way?
So we'll start at the start, right? So at the beginning of the engagement, you really want to do a benchmark, and I'll just keep this up. So I would look at three gaps, and to answer your question, the first two are the most important, which is the profit gap, and then you've got the value gap, and then I'll talk a little bit about the wealth gap in terms of what that means for the owner or the ownership. So first thing I want to know is I want to know what the profit gap is. So if I looked at your organization, the first thing I would do is I would say, okay, well, I need to normalize or recast the EBITDA. So what does that mean? And I'll go through this quickly. Basically, I'm trying to figure out if somebody else came in as a professional manager and I backed out certain things, well, going to back out the interest tax and so on. But what about rent or salaries? Is the owner paid too much or too little? Is there somebody else in the family who's on the payroll for a rather large number? Does the owner own the building and charge too little or too much rent? maybe the owner has an amazing car on the payroll, and perhaps the position doesn't warrant it, or you might not give a Bentley to to whoever's in that role. Is the owner's family all on the healthcare insurance, so their insurance policy? So all these things, some of them add in, some are add backs, and of course you've got the one-time things like consulting and legal and asset sales and write-offs. So at that point, we've really figured out, okay, well, if we normalized it, where would we be in terms of, not the owner, but a professional manager? And then we look at, through benchmarking, what could the profit be? So when we look at that, we go out there, the reference services I use, it becomes a little tricky with niche companies and private companies, but really, here's the idea is, where are you? What's your potential? And that's your profit gap. So that is impacted by some of the things you said. So if you, are more efficient, then the profit will rise. The next thing is the values, the intangibles. So think of when I talked about structural, social, customer, and talent, those intangibles hit there. And I'm not going to fully explain this, but if you look at our normal curve there, when I do a business readiness and attractiveness survey and combine that with the owner readiness, I'll get a number on here. It's a percentage. The average is 58%. Now, there's a couple of key numbers on here. There's 45%. Anything below that, your business, it might be a very viable business. It might be a business that supports you, your family, and your employees' families very well, but you can't sell it. Why is that? Perhaps because you're spinning plates. Perhaps it's because there's so much risk, or maybe you haven't prepared it correctly. Doesn't mean to say it's valueless. It means it just doesn't have value to somebody else. And this is a tough thing to say to an owner, is that it's not about what you think, it's about what the potential buyer thinks. On the other side, the good side, anything over at 72%, we start to see a lot of interest, right? At this point, your business is known, and you start to think about attracting much higher multiples. So what influences this? So when we talk about, when we bring in data and the potential for AI to enhance the business or perhaps create competition, what attractiveness and readiness score is there? If you're using data and you're maximizing the value, and you're not just chucking away the shavings from the Cadbury's flake, and you are using data to try and drive looking forward rather than that rear view mirror, your multiple will increase. Now, I'm not promising anything around a 4x, a 10x, or a 0x. It's entirely industry dependent, but it does give you some idea that if you really investigate your company and you really look at where you are and where you want to be, both in the profit and the value gap, and use that data to drive your decision making, and look at how you can improve that and not have that operational waste or even the data waste, you can increase the value of a company significantly. Yeah. So, when I talk about, the 5s or 6s, right, they're best in class or in a class of one, right? That's hard to get. It's not impossible. I mean, somebody has to get it. But where do you line? But a 5 or a 6, the owner's highly motivated and ready, right? And probably ready is more important than highly motivated. The business is running smoothly, and also the business is well known and well thought of. This is a business that people go, yeah, I'd like to run that place. So that's how the data impacts the value of the business, both, when you're talking about the profit gap, because of course you're multiplying the profit by the value there. So it's important to raise both at the same time. And so what does that mean? I'm sorry, Deepak, what did you say?
The intangibles that you're talking about come from the calculation of the EBITDA calculations that you were doing before. How does one come up with the tangibles value?
So there are a couple of ways of actually getting this. There's an informal valuation that I'm talking about in terms of your attractiveness and readiness and really diving in and figuring out, quality of earnings and that kind of stuff. And then there are formal valuations. So some of the stuff, we've all covered in business school, right? It's, a discounted cash flow. Some of it is really diving in and doing industry comps, but there are services out there who can do that and do that all the time. So they have a very good idea, and they, because they have so many clients, especially if you find one that specializes in your area, they're going to know what your business is worth. Now, one caveat, I believe, if you're going to get a formal valuation, I would get it through your lawyer, because then it becomes attorney-client privilege, and it's yours to keep private.
Yeah. Makes
So,
sense. Yeah.
but yeah, it's essentially the profit times the exit multiple. And so if you see, business brokers out there, it's usually running at a 3 to 4x right now for a lot of companies, depending on the company. So
Mm.
did that answer your
Okay.
question?
Yes. Yes. Thank you.
Awesome. Yeah, no problem. So what does it mean for the owner? Can I afford to retire in the style I want? Will I get my private island? So your financial advisor is going to do a detailed analysis out there, but I'm just going to play around and I'm going to use something simple called the rule of four, which is the idea that you can take 4% of the principal out without diminishing the total principal. So I've got Peter and Jane, their wealth goal is 36 million. It's good to be them. That's their goal. If you look at the rule of four and you want to figure it out yourself, if you want to retire on $100,000, you need about 2.5 million stashed away. So how do we calculate the wealth gap? So the first thing is, what do you have in the non-business asset realm? So these guys have things, real estate, 401ks and so on. They've got 10 million. So their wealth gap is actually $26 million. And the real question is your business worth $26 million to somebody else after tax? And owners often forget that one, it's after tax, and two, that they often forget to factor in their living needs, things like they'll be paying their own insurance. And health insurance is not cheap. Maybe they won't have a company car. Maybe the car insurance might. So it all adds up, and so you have to be quite careful about really figuring out what you need. So, but that's what the financial advisor will do. But this is the wealth gap. So this is what the business needs to sell for. If we look at it right now and we say, okay, based on the profits, based on the valuation multiple, we are, say, here, can we actually span from 20 to 36 million? Will we be able to increase the profit margin and the value gap? The value to bridge that last 16 million. If not, then we have a tough conversation. Perhaps you need to adjust your expectations. Maybe you're going to share that island with somebody else and not have a private island. But in reality, it becomes a tough conversation about perhaps can you get there, or do you need to adjust your expectations? But this is all done in the discovery phase when we talk with owners, and quite often owners are highly motivated. They have some kind of goal for the next step in their life, and I'll get to how they make decisions, but I want to quickly show you the exit options we talked about. I think most owners have an idea in their head about what the value of their business is. They also have an idea of that they're scared of, but what's a liquidation look like? There's actually a better option out there. That's that strategic exit, where you get somebody who sees the synergies between their business and yours and will pay a premium for that. You need to have a very ready and attractive business for that. And then there's other ways, right? We talk about market value, discounted cash flow, what are your assets, what are your comps. The blue ones are an external sale, the green ones are internal. Employee ownership would be something like an ESOP. So there's a range of values. And once again, these are all relative, they are not multiples. But it does give you some idea of how your exit choice will impact that. The next question is, well, why not just choose a strategic exit? Well, first of all, they're hard to get, but between these, what do you want to do, right? You have some measure of control in all this in terms of utilizing, what you can find in the business, data and investing to get there. And sometimes you just don't have options on the table. So what would be my criteria for a successful exit? So I'm going to do a balance, right? The first thing I think is probably the obvious thing is, what's the value after tax, right? What do I need? The next thing is control. And, question is, will you need to remain in the business after you've sold it? Some people are just fine. They take over a kind of research position, a guiding figure. Some people no, I need to run this business. I've been doing this for 20 years. I don't like the idea of what other people are doing, making decisions and not being able to, be the final say. I cannot stick around. Well, that impacts who might invest in your business. He typically wants people to remain in there and keep skin in the game. The last thing is legacy. How will you be remembered? So there's a couple of things there. I mean, it also plays into the value in your exit option. If you form an ESOP, your employees take over and your legacy lives on with the employees. The business stays, going. But if you, perhaps sell out to the highest bidder, how will you be remembered? What's going to happen to your employees? And if you live in a small town, let's say, will you still be able to eat at a local diner? 3 factors there to think of. in terms of balancing it. So that goes back to what exit options you might like to look at. And then that goes back to, in your profit and your value gap, will they reach what you need to get there? And can you make those changes? How should you make those changes? Well, we're talking about data and AI, and de-risking and looking at data to dynamically change your business based on facts. So you can start looking forward, not waste the flake, and use that front windshield rather than looking in the rearview mirror.
No, this is great. This is really interesting, Nick. What I'm taking away from this is for any business, once they start injecting AI in a structured way to de-risk their business, to improve their efficiencies, and overall set a platform for data-driven growth within that company. That company by itself becomes extremely valuable because over time, it's only going to get better with less people. So I think there's a big change now because of the level of technology and the level of automation that's coming in. This is even simple businesses like restaurants could see a huge benefit if, for example, they were very well placed in e-commerce, or like whether if they were very well listed on the internet, and AI was helping people find them very easily. That itself becomes a huge thing. Before it was just about the food, maybe now you're bringing in all the technology and your business is automatically more valuable just because of the technology. So yeah, this is great. Do you have any? I know we went through a lot of data here. Just to summarize, I just wanted to get a sense of, do you have any, not necessarily examples, but do you have any recipes for companies in general, right? So if you look at manufacturing companies, for example, or real estate companies, what sort of recipes would you recommend to them to increase their value and plan fruitful exits?
In a very general way, right? How do you
Yeah.
bake a generic loaf of bread? I think that first thing I do is look at the financials, right? That's usually where I start. And I think that it's important to know, the impact. And I work with companies to look at the impact of changes of 1% one day, changes of 1% on their, say, AP, AR, WIP, or inventory. Volume of sales and pricing, and the one day with AR, AP, but really hone in on what is going to be the impact of that change, and then use that to drive your strategy. Because at the end of the day, you want an ROI on this. And if you're not seeing it, you're going to abandon it. So I think the first thing is to really understand the finances, whether you're going to take it to a generalized company-wide level, to a line of business, or even down to a product. If I'm making an iron bar, what's the margins on that bar? And should I do certain things? And when you start digging in, you can see that you're losing money. And, I've discovered things like this, that, hey, if you sell this, you lose money on it. Why are you doing it? And there might be a great reason that it's a loss leader and you're bringing people in and so on. But when you look at that, so then you understand, what the impact's going to be. If I make this change from 1% to reduce, my, let's say my inventory, it will have this impact on my cash flow and this impact on my profit. Great. Now let's think about our strategies for implementing that. How could we shave that down? Are there better processes we can put in place where we're using data to drive decision making? Can we use AI to make things better? Perhaps, if we're looking at inventory, well, can we have a better ordering system? What can we do to make sure that perhaps we're not losing inventory? There's less waste. A whole host of things that happen in that space. I know you guys have looked a bit around deliveries, right? When does stuff arrive? What are you paying for? That's financial waste. If you pay for an 8 a.m. delivery, you want an 8 a.m. delivery. Now, if it's been delivered on time and I'm not touching it, most days until 2 p.m., why pay the extra? Or how do I figure out when I need the 8 a.m. versus the 2 p.m.? And so, looking at the data and then figuring out, is there something that a human can use to make those decisions? Or is it complex enough or big enough that you need to perhaps look at AI to drive that strategy?
Yes, that's great. Nick, thanks a lot for your time. This was very impactful and useful to listen in. And if you have any final words, we can talk through it. Otherwise, we're good.
Do you mind if I just put up my contact information?
Yeah, please do. Yes.
Okay. So this is me. You can reach me at nick@c-link.consulting. Love to have a chat with you. I don't know if I can help you, but part of my process is we do an initial chemistry call. We get to know each other. If you don't like me, that's absolutely okay. But I will try and be charming. And then sitting down, really figuring out, doing an assessment of where somebody's business is and figuring out, what are their goals. And then talking about, sitting down in detail, talking about the exit planning process. We've skimmed it today, and then we can decide if I can help you and makes sense to keep going. So thank you, Deepak. You're a
Yeah.
very gracious host, and I appreciate everybody listening to the podcast.
Thank you. And for everybody who's just listening in and not watching the screen, we'll have this information on the description of the podcast, so you can contact Nick if needed. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you, Deepak.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye.